Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. During the CBC debates, I used to hear this statement from Kenyans a lot. They used to say that the problem with our education system is that it has only theory and that it is not practical. I used to get a little irritated by this statement because I study theory and I know the value of theory. But as I went through the history books, I began to see that, yes, maybe Kenyans have a point, but it's not exactly what I expected and maybe not what you will expect. So in this video, I'm going to explain what is our school system for. Does it teach only theory? And I don't have definite answers, but I'm going to share what I'm learning as I read. This video is going to be a little long. It's going to go way back in history. It's going to go through different events in the world. But you remember in our first video on this series, I said that the mind is a muscle. And for people to be able to understand more and more complex things, it takes training. So that's what we are doing here, like athletes who train for a race. So karibuni sana. So to understand where we are coming from, we need to go back again to Victorian England. Now remember, when I've been talking about work, I've been saying that the social system which now governs the world is divided into two groups. One is made up of the people who don't work, and the other is made up of the people who work and whose work goes to enrich and sustain those who don't work. Now, the group of the people who don't work is the royalty. So before the 19th century, this group of people owned the land, and they enforced taxes. And then the peasants who were almost up to 90% of the population, would do the work, pay the taxes, and just live a life from hand to mouth. In between these groups, you had the nobility, the royalty, the knights, whose job was to enforce the rules of the royalty. So how does this system stay in place? Because you can't use the sword and the gun to maintain it, because that becomes too expensive. So to maintain it, you do three things. One, you justify it by saying that God ordained this system. So the king rules because God decided, and the role of the church is actually to coronate and endorse the royalty as chosen by God. The second thing you do is to say that you are culturally superior and you control ideas. So ideas that are taught, books that are written and read, you control that so that people never hear another idea except that which you want them to hear. And then you also control access to reading and writing. And then the third thing is to set up the structures of government. So you make sure that you control how resources are used and collected, and every decision about power about the country is made by you. But from the 16th century onwards, this idea was challenged. In the 16th century, two things posed a challenge to the power of the royalty. And this was in the form of the printing press, which was invented by Gutenberg, and the Reformation, which was inspired and pushed by Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King. So before the printing press, books used to be handwritten and copied. So if you wanted a second copy of a certain book or a third, somebody had to do the reading of the book and then copying it down by hand in writing. So books were not available to most people, and also they were dominated by the clergy. It was mainly the clergy who could read and write. So by inventing the printing press, Gutenberg was making reading, writing, and books more available to the general population. The Reformation was also a big event because Martin Luther was challenging the power and the dominance of the Catholic Church from Rome. And in those days, the masses used to be celebrated in Latin, which nobody spoke. The Bible used to be read in Latin, which nobody spoke, of course, except the clergy. And so Martin Luther started to question why the church was not allowing the scriptures to be available to everyone, since, as he was arguing, we have access to God directly through faith and through God's grace, and we don't need a priest to be an intermediary for us. So that meant that people had to have access to the Bible and read. And he even translated the Bible into the German that was spoken at the time. These two events had an implication for the royalty. Remember, I said the royalty were saying that they were ordained by God, and in fact the church used to coronate them. So challenging the power of the church meant challenging the power of the royalty. And how the royalty were able to mitigate this challenge was by starting their own Protestant churches in some of the countries. So Norway, Sweden, and England started their own churches. So there's the Church of Sweden, the Church of Norway, and of course, you know, the Church of England, since that is the ACK today. The second thing, the second platform on which the power of royalty was challenged was in the 17th century through the Enlightenment. You see now that the church was no longer the only voice when it comes to religion. It also meant that the church was not the only voice when it comes to ideas and science. And now you have the intellectuals starting to use science as a way of exploring knowledge and using reason and philosophy to discover the world, as opposed to relying on faith and relying on the clergy for knowledge. And towards the end of the 17th century, they also started talking about equality of all human beings. So they were starting to challenge the hierarchy on which the royalty depended. Now, the 18th century comes, and people have already challenged the authority of the church, the authority of knowledge, and now they start to ask questions about politics. Who makes decisions about resources, and what is the involvement of the people? In the 1770s, this was done by the Europeans who had gone to the United States, now what we know as the United States, and they said they cannot be taxed without representation. And in 1776, they successfully beat the king's army and became a republic. In 1789, those ideas filtered, and in France, the people started asking the same questions. Why should the peasants be starving when the royalty have so much to eat? And so they had a revolution and did away with the monarchy. And you can imagine that these events were not being read or taken lightly. The other countries surrounding France began to panic, and they needed to find a way to stem the ideas of the revolution from infecting their own countries. So come the 19th century, apart from worrying about how to keep power, the royalty are also being challenged by a new thing, which is the emergence of a middle class. Remember that wealth before was being handed down by inheritance. You were born into the right family and you became rich, and you inherited even the peasants who work on your land and their children. But in the Industrial Revolution, it became a problem for the royalty, because now people could earn a living using machines, and they could produce things faster using machines. So that meant you had a new class of people who became rich by industrialization and rather than inheritance. Now this was coming too close to home, because remember, the royalty earn money from other people's work. So they don't know how to work, and they had to find a way of co-opting that work into their interests. So what did they do? There's a word which I'm going to say now, which I'm sure is familiar to some of you: assimilation. When I discovered this in a book I read last week, and which I'm going to share in the links below, I was so surprised, because I thought that assimilation started with colonization. What is assimilation? For those of you who are familiar with the colonial policies in Africa, the French were particularly known for this policy. And the idea of assimilation is that you require people to become like you so that you can respect them. So you don't respect them before. What you tell them is, here are the rules and the standards you must follow, and when you meet them, you become like us. You will be acceptable and respectable like us. In the French colonies, that meant that you had to go to the schools and learn French. You had to behave like a French gentleman. And eventually, in some of the colonies, especially in Senegal, there was an option to become a French citizen, although it was not an option for many people. So that is assimilation. Assimilation starts with the assumption that you have a deficit, and if you meet this deficit, then I can respect you. And that deficit is set by me. And that's apparently that's the same principle that was operating in Europe before the Europeans came here, because in Victorian England, the middle class were given the option to assimilate into the aristocracy by doing exams, which is what I said in my previous video. And then by doing exams, you can join the aristocratic university system. You can get degrees, wear those robes that we like to wear. And then when you graduate, you can also join government, and you can join us in the Gulf Club and our afternoon high teas and whatever else it is that the aristocracy does. So the purpose of education was assimilation, even in Europe itself. Now, what was being taught in this education system? Now, this is where we finally come to the statement about theory. What was taught in this aristocratic system was stuff of the Roman Empire. They were taught about Rome, they were taught Latin, they were taught about Julius Caesar, Plato, Aristotle, the whole spiel. And even in the 19th century in England, the industrialists who were taking their children to these aristocratic schools were complaining. They were saying that when they take their kids to Oxford, the kids come with many big ideas, but they can't run the company. So this is not a complaint that started here. But you see, these nouveau riche, the middle class, had not understood what the education system was for. The education system was not for teaching practical skills. After all, they already had them. So what is the school going to give them? The point was that they needed cultural power to stay rich, and not just machines. And that is not theory, it's ideology. Basically, what we see here is that empire is a racket of assimilation. And assimilation is based on hierarchy. For someone to offer assimilation, They basically say, I am superior to you, and for you to be like me, you have to do what I say, and then I approve whether you are like me or not. And we must also note that even though Europeans were challenging the hierarchy at home, they didn't fundamentally shift that idea, and in fact, they spread it wherever they went, and often on behalf of the king and the church that they were opposing. They applied the hierarchy in these other areas, now not as a monarchy to their subjects, but as Europeans to non-Europeans. So, for example, we see that the United States started as a colony of England, and they called themselves New England and started cities and states like New York, New Jersey, New Hampshire. And when they went to Australia, New Zealand, and eventually Africa, they still came with the names and ideas that they were running away from at home. Even as the Americans fought against inequality and as they fought for independence, they enslaved Africans. And you find that the US Constitution was written by people who were owners of enslaved Africans. Even the pilgrims who were escaping from religious persecution for challenging the Catholic Church, when they arrived in the Americas, they laid the groundwork for the dispossession of indigenous people in the Americas, the genocide, and even the enslavement of Africans. And when the missionaries came here to Africa, they did the same thing. They laid the groundwork for colonization, so that when the merchants and the colonial government eventually came, they found the terrain already prepared. Even during the Enlightenment, when academics were talking about freedom and exploring the ability to explore ideas through science without seeking permission or approval from the church, they were also writing about the inequality of races and producing the ideologies that would later justify empire and racism. And the working classes and who came here from Britain as settlers, they also complained in London of being discriminated against, but used that same discrimination against us here. So, for example, you find that the settlers who were in Kenya were writing to London complaining about discrimination against their own children because their children were not being employed by the colonial government in Nairobi. Instead, the colonial government was bringing recruits from London. And yet, these same settlers were discriminating against Africans, dispossessing them, and demanding that they get an inferior education. And this hierarchy remains in Kenya despite independence. We still report to London and we still affirm their rules, and we are not allowed to have our own schools, our own hospitals, unless we are applying the rules from abroad. And of course, they're not going to say it's because we are assimilating. They'll use words like benchmarking, global standards, quality assurance, best practices, but it's still the same idea that we have to assimilate to a system that is superior to us. Basically, the job of the assimilated is to spread ideology. But of course, in the school system, they're not going to say you are coming to school to learn ideology. So how does ideology work? You might be wondering, who cares? What difference does it make? They sound the same anyway. In a sense, they are close because both of them are stories that explain. But theory explains why the world is the way it is. Ideology explains how the world should be. So the purpose of theory is to help us understand, but the purpose of ideology is to rule. So what this Roman-centric Roman Empire curriculum was doing was that it was creating rulers. And that's what the school system is for. It is to train rulers. Somebody put out this tweet yesterday when we were having a discussion, which illustrates what I'm talking about. Now, before you think, what does Oxford have to do with us? Uh, Remember that a good number of the colonial officers who were sent here by the British government came from Oxbridge. That was where they were trained. And even they had a curriculum that was specifically that put specific emphasis on the Roman Empire and the role of the British Empire in the world. So the administrators also did the Plato, the Aristotle, etc., to learn ideology. They didn't learn science, they didn't learn culture, even though they were coming here. And the idea was that when they come here, even though they don't understand us, don't know us, their job is to further the goals of the empire. So there was no need for them to understand anything about us. The other thing it meant was that the colonial administrators were incompetent. They were so incompetent, even the British settlers here complained that they were moribund, that they were not being able to make decisions. They were depending too much on waiting for London to tell them what to do. And they even went to London to complain. And I will put a link to an article that explains that. This also means that if these are the people who set up the colonial state here, it means that the Africans who ended up joining government and joining the school system also began to think like aristocrats. And you will see this even today when lawyers are wearing wigs and saying that we should not question what they wear, because who are we? What do we know? It also means that even universities are very aristocratic in their thinking. They're always talking about who deserves to be in the university and who doesn't. The other thing is that it means there's a lot of violence, that the state has to use violence because they know nothing, they cannot reason, and so when they want to implement something, they have to use violence. That was the way it was in the colonial times, and things haven't changed. And I'm going to share a video that was done by Boniface Mwangi about the training of the police. So how does ideology work? The bottom line of how ideology works is by ensuring that everybody is on the same page. So whether you go to church, to school, to media, everywhere you go, people are basically following the same line. Let me give an example. Let's say that I start an ideology that Dr. Wandia walks on water. Maybe I want to be the supreme leader, and so I start this idea. I don't need to lie so much. I just need to make sure that everywhere you go, even if you have testimony or evidence proving that Dr. Wandia doesn't walk on water, your testimony won't be valid and it won't be heard. So, for example, maybe you go to church and you try to say, the Bible says that God made all of us in God's image, so Dr. Wandia can't possibly walk on water. What will happen? You'll be told, stop judging. Don't you want Dr. Wandia to get her blessing? Let's love one another. You'll be thrown at a Bible verse, and basically you won't be heard. So maybe you go to the school and you say, I'm going to prove through scholarship, science, and experiments that Dr. Wandia cannot possibly walk on water. What will happen? You will fail in exams. You will be maybe even beaten. And when you fail in exams, it means you can't get a certificate, which means you can't get a job. Then maybe you say, okay, I'm going to tell the public, and maybe you start telling people in your neighborhood, you know, Dr. Andia says that she can walk on water, but I don't think so. Or maybe you go to a public meeting and you say the same. What will happen? The cops will come and arrest you for disturbing the peace. It's not even for contradicting Dr. Andia. You'll be arrested for disturbing the peace. And when the news is reported that evening, it will be reported that police today stopped a public meeting that was becoming unruly. So you see, wherever you go, nobody hears you, and your experience, your ideas are considered invalid. Basically, what ideology does is to shut out all other opinions, ideas, and stories, so that only one story is dominant wherever you go. So what skill then does the school system teach? It does not teach theory, it teaches abstraction. And what is abstraction? Abstraction is divorcing events or ideas from people, place, and time. You make them sound so general, and you remove any specifics of people, place, and time that may be attached to an idea. And that is why you see that the middle class cannot deal with people, place, and time. They call it judging. So, for example, let's say the government says we're going to have a lockdown. When you say, but what does that mean for specific people in the low-income areas who live from hand to mouth? Then you're told, why aren't you supporting the government? Don't you understand that we are going to get sick? You know, what they are against is not that you are opposing an idea. It's that you are asking for the specifics. Another thing that abstraction does is that it teaches us to unsee history and reality. And instead we talk of things being universal or objective. So for example, if we say, for example, the way that the police behaved yesterday is the way they behaved in 1952, people will tell you, oh, stop going back in the past, forgive and forget, we are independent. We'll always find a reason to avoid history. Or they'll say, why are you blaming the colonialists? We have been independent for a number of years. Basically, the idea is to remove history and reality from whatever is said and done. And that is why the school system teaches us to make excuses for when things don't work. So if things don't work, for example, if now it's clear that Dr. Wandia does not walk on water, we blame ourselves for what we see. We say, maybe I didn't see properly, maybe I need new specs, or we are beaten or arrested by the police. Other times we demand solutions. We are told, okay, maybe she doesn't walk on water, but what's your solution? Which is basically a way of saying, how do we create the circumstances so that Dr. Wandia can walk on water? It doesn't matter whether we need her to walk on water. You know, that idea is not challenged. What we are being asked for is a solution on how to make that proposition work. Or else we start asking for policy, and this is where you hear people saying the policy is good but the implementation is bad. There's nothing like that. A policy is its implementation. So if the policy is that Dr. Wandia walks on water and she can't, that's not an implementation problem. It's a problem of the policy as it is. So we talk of creating new policies to help Dr. Wandia look like she's walking on water. We form NGOs. We say, okay, we're going to start a school for the poor, because the poor seem to not understand that Dr. Wandia walks on water, and we need to have a school where we can teach them to appreciate the importance of her walking on water. That's what ideology does. It's a single story that silences all other stories and then uses force to make sure that we keep on holding on to a story even if it defies reality. And there's a reason why this abstraction is done that way. You've noticed that when things are done, especially by the government, it's like nobody is responsible. I remember during CBC, I used to keep asking, who wrote this curriculum? Because the names I was seeing on the curriculum framework were not Kenyan. But when I asked which Kenyans wrote this curriculum, I'm told, I'm not given any names, I'm just told Kenyans. And the reason why I wanted to know was because education is such an academic exercise. So in academic practice, the least we should have known was who wrote this thing so that we can call them to account and ask them, what did you mean by this? Why is this not there? But up to now, we don't know who wrote that curriculum. We're just being told it's Kenyans. Or even look at the Kariobanki evictions. People even went to the court to get injunctions against the evictions. But we don't know who carried them out. We don't know who gave the order. We don't know who drove the tractors into people's houses and demolished them. All we are told, all we just found out was people were evicted. And the only time somebody came up in person, the CS, to say, to comment, it was to say the demolitions are going to end. But did they end? No, they happened again. Who did them? Who ordered them? We don't know. So the point of this abstraction is to make us get used to this system of rule by nobody. Things just happen and you can't hold anyone to account. But even in the workplace, and this is why I've been talking about work, even in the workplace, we all know, those of us who are employed, that when your boss tells you to do something, even if you don't agree with it, there's nothing you can say. And even when you're asked, why did you do this? You will say, I got orders. From who? Silence. And it's this culture of silence, of things happening but nobody doing them, is what the education system teaches us. Even in my classes, this is the biggest challenge I have found. It's in getting students to tell stories. In class, they might, be able to say, I saw this, I noticed this, so and so they said this. But when you get the paper they are writing, it's abstractions. This one, so and so 2019, so and so 1946, saying everything out there, and they can't relate what they are saying to real concrete people, places, and time. In a nutshell, what am I saying? I'm saying that our schooling system does not teach theory and it does not teach practice. It teaches us to accept the ideology that divides the whole world into a system where some work and others do not work, and they profit from the work of others. So the ideology is not just a Kenyan problem, it's a global problem, because the government implements this ideology on behalf of others. It's not even just the rich here, it's the rich globally. The second thing is that this schooling system is the reason why the middle class find it very difficult to accept the weaknesses of this system and to accept that the system has to go. And that is why you find them always defending the system. So if they're not calling you negative and asking for solutions, they are explaining what can be done. They are trying to do policy, asking donors for money, everything to fix the fact that the system is not working, instead of asking, why do we have this system in the first place? Why not just let it go? And when people ask you for solutions, they are not really interested in the solutions. What they're asking is, how can we make the reality that we are seeing go away? That's what that solutionist question is about. So this demand for TVET is not actually a demand for practical subjects. It's an acceptance that this system produces rulers and the rest will be left by the wayside. And what can we do with the people or the majority who are left by the wayside? You're told TVET and you celebrate. And yet probably that TVET is about you being rejected. This also means that this story about arts and STEM is a distraction. It's not genuine, because even STEM is not what is going to be taught. It is TVET. There's a difference between TVET and STEM. TVET is for doing the practical work, for you people who are going to be working to enrich others. STEM is for the rulers. It's for those who want to regulate the STEM, the TVETers. And in fact, even the sciences are not going to be taught. That's STEM, we are being told. It will, because who are the engineers who are designing the railways? It's the Chinese and others. Your job is to be the fundi, not to be the designer. And that's why TVET is for you, science is for others. And so stop asking for practical skills. We need knowledge. And it's up to us to either decide whether we are going to apply that knowledge materially or whether we are going to use that knowledge to develop ideas. But knowledge goes either way. There's no separation, as I've said in the second video, there's no separation between knowledge and skills. I can't believe I'm doing this, given how much I hate the question on solutions. But this is what I suggest. We need education from many places, not just the school system. And this also means that we need to find ways to make other kinds of education legitimate and not just rely on NEC and school certificates. How we do this is something that democracy can decide. It's something that we can all discuss and come to an agreement on. And money should not be the major reason for people to be considered to have expertise, because money is the work of others. It's not one's own work alone. And there are two elements of this solution. The first is what I've been talking about through this series: stories, stories, stories. The only reason this system survives is because we don't tell our stories and we don't listen to other people's stories. Even Parliament is supposed to be the place where our stories are taken to inform policy and law. But as you know, our MPs don't listen to us because they are embedded in this philosophy that our job is to work and their job is to profit from the work that we do. And that's why they're always increasing salaries without thinking of what it means for us who do the work. The other element of expanding this education is to create new sites of learning. Let's have book club discussions. The church already has Bible study. Let's also have book studies for other kinds of books. Let's create knowledge. Let's build cultural centers. Let's support the arts, because the arts is where we create and legitimize other knowledge. Let's build libraries and share our materials. Because ideology is not just about a single story. It's about silencing all other stories. And that's why Yvonne Owor's book, Dust, talks about silence as a language in Kenya. We silence people's stories when they don't conform to the main story of exploitation and rule by those who don't work. So we need to be able to create other stories, because ideology makes its own semi-stories, which it uses to delegitimate our stories. So the stories like racism, sexism, tribalism, discrimination against people of disabilities, all these stories are meant to delegitimize real stories from reality and human beings. And so you have created stories like a savage Africa, the black skin being somehow inferior, as a way of saying, whenever you talk and you're a black person, we're not going to listen to what you have to say. And eventually, when people's stories keep getting ignored in this way, they eventually have to attack the institutions that are silencing them. So, what we are seeing in Minneapolis and the rest of the United States following the murder of George Floyd, it's about people saying, we're tired of our stories about the police, about discrimination in education and economy being ignored and being taken as invalid because we don't have the right certificates and the right skin color. So it's not just that Black Lives Matter, it's that Black stories also matter. Those stories have to be heard, and the institutions need to be developed according to those stories, not according to some abstract principle. And we should be fighting for a new system that accommodates all our stories. And that's what we call democracy, where everybody brings their stories and we share and we talk and we agree on a way forward. And even education is supposed to be that. We should not fight for assimilation into an inhuman system which is designed to feed a few from the work of the many. So it's not that we want more blacks, more women, more tribes into this system for a few. We want the system to be for all of us. And how do we do this? We do this by exposing the reason why our stories are being excluded. We must refuse terms like objectivity and universal, or it's the law, without talking about real people, real place, and real time. Because every human institution is grounded in time and place and with specific people. Even theology, there's nothing like an objective God or an objective faith. Faith in God is expressed through theology by people talking about their faith as applied to specific people in a specific time and in a specific place. I'm going to share some links to the discussions on theology by Reverend Canon Omondi and Dr. Damaris Pasitao, so that you can see that there's nothing like objective faith. We must talk about our faith in concrete terms in relation to reality and to our humanity as it is now and as it was before with others. The second thing we need to do is to keep trying to replace the single story that the world must be divided between those who work and those who live off the work of others. We must replace that story with the human story of work. Work as dignity, work as creativity, work as love, which is what I talk about in my Kazi ni Maisha series. And this is not a local struggle, it's a global one. So we are not alone. We have other people who are fighting everywhere in their own ways, through their own stories, for a just system where we can be human, where we can have dignity, where we can be creative, and where we can love. And that's the kind of system we want for our children. So keep telling your stories, and thank you for watching.